My husband left me at 73 for a younger woman and took all of our shared property. A week later, he married his perfect woman. But when I saw her face, I couldn't stop laughing because she was. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always say that the worst moments of your life arrive without warning. I used to disagree with that. I used to think that if you paid close enough attention, the signs were always there. Written in the margins of ordinary days, hiding behind polite smiles and reasonable explanations. But when it actually happened to me, I realized I had been wrong about everything. My name is Margaret Holloway. Most people called me Maggie. I was 73 years old, a retired school administrator from Beaumont, Texas, and for 48 years I had been married to Richard Holloway, a civil engineer, a church deacon, a man who ironed his own shirts and called his mother every Sunday until she passed. We had raised 2 children in the yellow house on Clover Street. We had buried a dog, survived a flood, and celebrated grandchildren together. We were, by every outward measure, a success story. Our life was not glamorous. It was better than that. It was steady. Richard took his coffee black. I took mine with too much cream. Every Saturday morning, we drove to the farmer's market on Fifth Avenue, where I bought tomatoes I didn't need, and Richard complained about the parking. We argued about the thermostat. We watched the evening news and disagreed about the commentary. We were the kind of couple that younger people looked at and said, "That's what I want someday." And I believed it. God help me. I believed every bit of it. The first sign came in February, 14 months before everything collapsed. Richard started going to the gym. Now, I want to be clear. There is nothing wrong with a 75-year-old man deciding to improve his health. Nothing at all. But Richard had not set foot in a gym since 1987. He had always said that exercise was for people who didn't do real work. And suddenly, 3 mornings a week, he was up at 6, dressed in new athletic clothes I had never seen him purchase, and gone before I finished my first cup of coffee. He came home quieter than usual, distracted. He started using his phone in the bathroom, which he had never done before in 48 years of marriage. I told myself it was nothing. Men his age had health scares. Maybe his doctor had told him something he didn't want to worry me with. That was the explanation I chose, because it was the kindest one available. The second sign came in April. He bought a new car, a silver Audi, the kind of car that belonged to a man trying to look 40. He said the old Buick needed too many repairs. I nodded and asked no questions, because that is what you do after 48 years. You learn which questions not to ask. By June, he was taking weekend trips for what he called consulting work. He'd been retired for 6 years. I said nothing. I watered my tomatoes and read my books and told myself I was being paranoid. And then came the morning of July 14th, which I will remember until the last day of my life. Richard sat down across from me at the kitchen table, our kitchen table, the oak one we'd bought at an estate sale in 1988, and he told me he wanted a divorce. He said he had met someone. He said he had not been happy for years. He said he was sorry, but he needed to live his truth. His truth. That phrase, in his mouth, sounded like something he had rehearsed from a television program. I did not cry. I did not scream. I sat very still and I looked at the man I had shared a bed with for nearly 5 decades, and I felt something I can only describe as the floor falling away beneath me. He moved out within the week. His lawyer contacted me before mine even knew what was happening. Richard had been planning this for months. The accounts had been quietly restructured. The property documents had been shifted. By the time I understood what was happening, most of what we had built together had already been moved into arrangements that favored only him. He married her 8 days later. A civil ceremony, someone told me, very small. I heard about it from our neighbor, Carol Simmons, who had seen the announcement on social media. Carol came to my door with a casserole and a look of profound pity, and she showed me a photograph on her phone. Richard and his new bride, standing on courthouse steps, grinning like teenagers. I looked at the woman's face, and I laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because the woman standing next to my husband of 48 years, the woman he had left me for, the woman he had apparently been building a secret life with, was Deborah Finch. Deborah Finch, who had worked under me at the Beaumont Independent School District for 3 years. Deborah Finch, whom I had personally recommended for termination in 2004 after an internal audit revealed she had been falsifying budget reports. Deborah Finch, who had looked me in the eye at her exit interview and said, "You'll regret this, Mrs. Holloway." 20 years later, she was standing on courthouse steps in a white dress next to my husband. I stopped laughing, because that was the moment I understood. This was not a coincidence. This was something else entirely. The laughter died in my throat, and what replaced it was something cold and very clear. Carol was still standing in my doorway with her casserole, watching my face with the cautious expression of someone who wasn't sure whether to call a doctor. I thanked her. I took the dish. I closed the door, set the food on the counter without touching it, and sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen. I have always been an administrator. 40 years in public school systems teaches you one thing above all else. When a crisis hits, the first thing you do is take inventory. You do not panic. You do not collapse. You find out exactly what you have, exactly what you've lost, and exactly what your options are. Emotion is a luxury. Information is not. So I made a list. The house on Clover Street was in both our names, or it had been. Richard's lawyer had filed a partition action the same week he moved out, citing irreconcilable differences and requesting that the property be sold and proceeds divided. I had received the paperwork by certified mail, which I had signed for without fully understanding what it meant. That was my first mistake. The joint savings account, 42 years of careful saving, had been drawn down by 60% over the previous 8 months. I had seen the statements come in and assumed Richard was managing some investment I didn't fully understand. That was my second mistake. The retirement accounts were more complicated. Richard had rolled his pension into an IRA 3 years ago, and the restructuring had been done in a way that, according to the documents I was only now reading carefully, classified it as his separate property. Whether that classification would hold in court was a question I could not yet answer. The car I drove, a 2019 Honda, was in my name. That, at least, was mine. The furniture, the artwork, the small antique pieces we had accumulated over decades. Richard had taken what he wanted when he moved out, and I had been too stunned to stop him. I sat at that kitchen table until midnight, reading every document I could find in the filing cabinet, making notes in the margins, and slowly understanding the full shape of what had been done to me. It had been methodical, patient. The kind of plan that takes months to execute quietly while the person being dismantled continues to water her tomatoes and ask no questions. The fear came then. Real fear, not the sharp, sudden kind, but the deep, settling kind that lands in your chest like a stone and stays there. I was 73 years old. I had not worked in 7 years. My health was good but not certain. If this went wrong, if the courts ruled against me, if Richard's lawyers were better than mine, I stopped that line of thinking. I am not a woman who has ever permitted herself to finish sentences that end in disaster. I knew two things with certainty. First, Richard had not acted alone. The legal preparation, the financial restructuring, that required inside knowledge and careful timing. Deborah Finch had spent 3 years working in school district administration. She understood budgets, documents, institutional processes. She had not walked into this marriage by accident. Second, whatever she had told Richard about me over the past however many months, she had her own history. A history that was documented, official, and on file. The next morning, I did 3 things. First, I called my daughter Linda, who lived in Austin, and I told her everything. Not the soft version, not the version designed to avoid worry. Everything. Linda was 51 years old and worked in real estate law. She listened without interrupting for 20 minutes, and when I finished, she said, "Mom, don't touch anything else in that house and don't sign anything. I'm driving up tomorrow." Second, I called my own doctor and scheduled a full health assessment because I needed to know my baseline. If this was going to be a long fight, and I was already certain it would be, I needed to know what I was working with physically. Third, I went to the Beaumont Public Library and spent 4 hours at a computer, reading everything I could find about divorce law in Texas, marital property rights, and the legal status of assets transferred or restructured during the 12 months preceding a divorce filing. What I found was both frightening and, in a very specific way, encouraging. Texas is a community property state. That meant that most of what Richard and I had accumulated during our marriage was legally half mine, regardless of whose name appeared on the account, regardless of what his lawyers had restructured. The 60% withdrawal from our joint account, if it could be shown to have been dissipated in anticipation of divorce, could potentially be treated as waste and counted against Richard's share of the settlement. The IRA reclassification might not hold under community property rules if the underlying funds had been earned during the marriage. Might, potentially, could be shown. I needed a lawyer, not a general practitioner, not a friend's recommendation. I needed the best family law attorney in Jefferson County, Texas, and I needed them before Richard's side moved another inch. I also needed something else, something I had already begun to think about on the drive home from the library. Deborah Finch believed she had erased herself from my life 20 years ago. She believed she was starting fresh, stepping into a wealthy man's world with no one who knew her past within arm's reach. She had forgotten that I kept records of everything. I always had. And sitting in my car in the library parking lot in the flat July heat of Beaumont, Texas, I reached into the back of my mind and retrieved a memory I hadn't visited in 2 decades. A manila folder, a signed letter, and a very specific set of dates that told a story Deborah Finch would very much prefer remained buried. I allowed myself one small, quiet smile. Then I started the car and drove home. Linda arrived on a Thursday morning with 2 overnight bags, a laptop, and the focused expression she had inherited from me. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Richard had delivered his quiet demolition, and went through every document together. Linda was methodical and calm in the way that only people who have spent years reading legal language can be calm. She flagged 3 items immediately: the partition filing on the house, the IRA reclassification paperwork, and a transfer of $23,000 from our joint account to a personal account in Richard's name alone, made 11 months prior, just inside the window, where it could be characterized as pre-divorce asset dissipation. "You need Walter Grimes," Linda said, closing the folder. Walter Grimes was a family law attorney in Beaumont who had practiced for 31 years and had, according to Linda's research, handled some of the most complex marital property cases in Southeast Texas. He was not inexpensive. Book him, I said. We met with Walter the following Monday. His office was on the third floor of a building downtown, quiet and deliberately unimpressive in the way that successful lawyers' offices sometimes are, as though the seriousness of the work required no decoration. Walter was a compact, gray-haired man with a habit of writing everything down by hand. He listened to my account without expression, asked 17 questions, and then said, "Mrs. Holloway, the IRA reclassification is going to be the centerpiece of this. If we can establish that the funds were acquired during the marriage and the restructuring was timed deliberately, we have a strong argument. The $23,000 transfer is useful, supporting evidence of intent. The partition on the house. That's beatable." "What's our timeline?" Linda asked. "Contested property division in Texas can run 12 to 18 months, Walter said. "Possibly longer if they fight hard." "They'll fight hard," I said. He nodded. "Then we plan for 18 months. I signed the engagement letter. I paid the retainer from the savings account that was still in my name alone. Money I had set aside over many years for reasons I had never fully articulated to myself, as though some quiet part of me had always known that self-reliance was not optional. I did not feel afraid in that office. I felt the particular calm of someone who has stopped hoping the situation will improve on its own and has decided to make it improve. That same week, I drove to the storage unit we rented on Highway 69, a unit I had maintained for years to hold seasonal items, old tax returns, the accumulated paper record of a long life. Richard, in his haste or his arrogance, had not touched it. He had forgotten about it entirely, which told me something about how thoroughly he had stopped paying attention to the details of our shared life. I spent 3 hours in that storage unit, and I found what I had been looking for. In a banker's box labeled BISD, Administrative Files 2001 to 2005, I found the folder I had kept from Deborah Finch's termination. Inside, the internal audit report, the signed findings memo, her formal letter of termination, bearing my signature as recommending administrator, and, most critically, a handwritten note that Deborah had left on my desk the day of her exit interview. The note said, in her own handwriting, "You've made an enemy today, Mrs. Holloway. I have a long memory. 20 years later, she had married my husband 8 days after he left me. I photographed every document with my phone. I photographed the note twice. Then I placed the originals in a separate folder, drove directly to Walter Grimes's office, and left them with his assistant with a brief explanatory note. What I didn't know, what I found out later from Carol Simmons, who had sources I did not question, was that within 48 hours of my meeting with Walter, Richard received a call from his own attorney advising him that I had retained counsel and that the case was going to be contested. Apparently, Richard had expected me to accept the initial settlement offer his lawyer had sent. It was a document that awarded me the car, my personal items, and a modest monthly payment structured as spousal support, a number that, after the mortgage on the Clover Street house was resolved, would have left me with approximately $1,400 a month to live on at the age of 73. He had expected me to take it. The call from his attorney changed the atmosphere in that new apartment of theirs considerably, Carol told me. She had heard it from the building manager's wife, who had heard raised voices through the wall on a Tuesday evening. I thought about that as I drove home. I thought about Richard and Deborah sitting in whatever they were calling their home, recalculating. Deborah would understand, better than Richard, what contested litigation meant. She had been through institutional proceedings before. She knew how documents worked. She would be afraid of the storage unit if she even remembered it existed. She would be afraid of what I might have kept. She was right to be afraid. But what she didn't know yet, what nobody knew yet except me and Walter Grimes, was that I had also, quietly and without fanfare, contacted a forensic accountant named Patricia Osee, who had been recommended by Linda, and asked her to trace the full financial history of our joint accounts over the preceding 24 months. That process was underway. The first piece of the truth was already in Walter's hands. The rest was coming. Patricia Osee delivered her preliminary findings on a Wednesday afternoon, 6 weeks after I had retained her, in a document that ran to 22 pages and contained enough highlighted entries to make Walter Grimes set down his pen and sit quietly for a moment before speaking. The $23,000 transfer was only the beginning. Over the previous 26 months, Richard had made a series of financial movements that, taken individually, might each have seemed explainable. Taken together, they formed a pattern that Patricia described in her report as systematic pre-divorce asset restructuring consistent with deliberate dissipation. There were transfers to a personal investment account I had not known existed. There were payments, described on bank statements as consulting fees, to an LLC that Patricia had traced, with some effort, to an address that turned out to be Deborah Finch's previous residence. There were 2 wire transfers, each just under the federal reporting threshold, to an account in another state. In total, Patricia estimated that approximately $147,000 of community property assets had been moved or obscured in the 2 years preceding Richard's announcement at the kitchen table. I sat with that number for a long time after the meeting. $147,000. 48 years of a shared life. And this was what the accounting looked like underneath. Walter filed an amended response to the divorce petition that same week, incorporating Patricia's findings and formally requesting a full financial accounting, the return of dissipated assets, and an unequal division of the remaining community property in my favor as remedy for the documented waste. He also filed a motion to compel discovery, requiring Richard's legal team to produce all financial records for the preceding 3 years. That was the first official move, and it landed exactly as Walter had predicted it would. 3 days later, my doorbell rang at 7 in the morning. I was in my robe with my coffee when I opened the door and found Richard standing on the porch of the house that was still legally half his, looking like a man who had not slept well. Behind him, sitting in the silver Audi at the curb, I could see a figure I recognized. Deborah Finch did not come to the door. She stayed in the car. That told me something. "Maggie," Richard said. His voice had the particular quality of a man attempting to sound reasonable while feeling cornered. "I think we need to talk." "My attorney would prefer you communicate through his office," I said. I had rehearsed this sentence. I said it pleasantly. "This has gone far enough," he said. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. The offer we made was fair." "Walter doesn't think so," I said. "Neither does Patricia." Something shifted in his face at Patricia's name. He hadn't known I'd hired an accountant. That was visible in the half-second before he recovered. "You're going to run through your savings on lawyers," he said. "Is that what you want? To spend the next 2 years in court?" "I spent 48 years building what we had together," I said. "I'll spend 2 years making sure I get what belongs to me." He stared at me. The Richard I had known for nearly 50 years, the reasonable man, the church deacon, the steady presence, looked back at me for just a moment, and then something else looked out through his eyes. Something that had been there for a while, probably, that I simply hadn't been willing to see. "You're being vindictive," he said. "I'm being thorough," I said. "Good morning, Richard." I closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a moment with my heart going faster than I would have liked. Then I went to the kitchen and refilled my coffee. The following morning, things escalated. I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. The voice was female, measured, and recognizable despite 20 years of distance. "Margaret," Deborah said, "I think it's time you and I had a direct conversation." "I don't believe we have anything to discuss," I said. My attorney handles all matters related to the divorce. This isn't about the divorce, she said. This is about those files you pulled from your storage unit. I know what you sent Walter Grimes, and I want you to understand something. If you use those documents to cause problems for Richard's case, we will make certain information public that you would prefer stayed private. I let the pause stretch. What information? I asked, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to hear how far she was willing to go. There were complaints filed against you during your last 3 years at BISD, she said, about your management style, about decisions you made. I kept copies, and there are people who would be interested in a certain narrative about why a long-serving administrator's career ended when it did. I had retired voluntarily, with commendations, after 40 years of service. The complaints she was referencing were 2 grievances, both investigated and dismissed, both on file, both publicly documented as unsubstantiated. Deborah, I said, you were terminated for falsifying budget documents. That is a matter of institutional record. What you're describing is an attempt to intimidate a party in active litigation. I'm going to let my attorney know about this call. She hung up. I sat down. My hands were not entirely steady, and I allowed them to be unsteady for a few minutes, because I am 73 years old, and I have learned that pretending not to feel things is not the same as being strong. Then I called Walter Grimes and reported the conversation in full. Don't respond to any further contact from her, Walter said. If she calls again, record it if you can, then call me. What she just did is potentially witness tampering. At minimum, it helps our case. After I hung up, I sat in my garden for a long time. The tomatoes needed water. The afternoon was hot and very quiet. I thought about everything. Not in a productive way, not making lists or plans, but just sitting with the weight of it. I gave myself 4 days. 4 days to rest, to be frightened, to miss the life I had thought I had, and to grieve whatever it was I was grieving. I had earned that. On the 5th day, I got up at 6, made my coffee, and went back to work. The new offer came through Richard's attorney on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the doorstep confrontation. It was better than the first one. Considerably better, in fact. Enough that I recognized immediately that Patricia's forensic accounting report had frightened them. The new offer proposed a 60-40 division of the remaining community property in my favor, a structured payment to address a portion of the documented transfers, and a monthly support figure that was almost twice the original number. Walter walked me through it on the phone, neutrally, as good lawyers do. He presented the numbers without editorial. Then he waited. "What's your read?" I asked. "It's a real offer," he said. "They're trying to avoid discovery. The full financial accounting we've requested would require Richard's legal team to produce documentation they'd prefer not to produce in court. This offer is designed to make this go away before that happens." "And if I take it?" "You'd receive significantly more than the original offer. You'd avoid another year of litigation. You'd also accept approximately 60% of what I believe you're entitled to, and you would release all claims related to the documented transfers." "Meaning Deborah's consulting fees disappear?" "Correct." I thanked him and said I would think about it. What I thought about for the rest of that day was not the money. The money was important. It was my security, my independence, my ability to live the rest of my life without fear. But it was not the whole of it. I thought about the LLC with Deborah's address. I thought about the phone call where she had threatened me. I thought about a woman who had spent 20 years nursing a grievance, positioning herself, and systematically helping a man dismantle his own marriage in order to step into it, and who was now, apparently, hoping that a moderately improved settlement offer would cause me to let all of that simply evaporate. I thought about what it would mean to say yes, to take the money and go quiet, to let Deborah Finch win. I went to church that Sunday. Not something I did every week, but something I did when I needed to be somewhere that reminded me of the longer view of things. Afterward, in the parking lot, I ran into Reverend Gloria Tate, who had been pastor of our congregation for 12 years and who had known Richard and me as a couple for most of that time. She asked how I was. I told her the truth. She listened the way that certain women of a certain generation listen, without interrupting, without offering solutions before solutions had been requested, with the full weight of her attention. When I finished, she said, "Maggie, you've been taking care of other people's business for 40 years. You know how to fight for what's right when it belongs to somebody else. The question is whether you believe you deserve the same." I drove home thinking about that. That week, Linda came back from Austin for a long weekend, and she brought with her two of my oldest friends, Rosemary Chu, who had taught third grade at my school for 22 years, and Adele Washington, who had retired 2 years before me and now grew prize-winning roses in her backyard in Port Arthur. The four of us sat on my back porch in the evening, and I told them everything. Not the careful, composed version I had been presenting to the world. Everything. The fear, the anger, the moments when some part of me had wanted to simply give up and sign whatever they put in front of me because fighting was exhausting and I was 73 and I just wanted it to be over. Rosemary said, "You have never once in your professional life accepted an outcome that was unjust just because fighting it was inconvenient. Why would you start now?" Adele said, "Honey, if you take that offer, she wins, and you will know that for the rest of your life." Linda said nothing. She just refilled my glass of iced tea and let them do the work. I turned down the offer the following Monday. Walter filed it with a brief response. Plaintiff respectfully declines the proposed settlement and confirms her intention to proceed to full discovery and trial, if necessary. I heard through Carol Simmons's extensive informal intelligence network that when Richard's attorney informed him of my response, Richard said nothing for a long moment and then asked to reschedule the rest of his afternoon appointments. Deborah reportedly had more to say, but I was not there to hear it, and I was not particularly interested in what it was. What I was interested in was what Patricia Osei had found in the most recent batch of financial records. Records that Richard's team had been compelled to produce and had turned over late, which Walter had already noted for the court. Patricia had spent 10 days going through them. She called me on a Friday morning and said, in her precise, careful voice, "Mrs. Holloway, I think you should come in. I've found something in the LLC records that changes the picture somewhat." "Good or bad?" I asked. "For you?" A pause. "Very good." I made the appointment for Monday. I spent the weekend in the garden, watering my tomatoes, deadheading the roses Adele had given me as a cutting 3 years ago, and feeling, for the first time since July, something that was cautiously close to confidence. I did not trust it yet, but I let myself feel it. The tomatoes, at least, were finally ready to pick. They came on a Saturday morning, which was deliberate. Saturday mornings had always been ours. The farmer's market, the easy rhythm of a shared weekend. Coming on a Saturday was a choice, and I registered it as such. I saw Richard's silver Audi pull up to the curb from my kitchen window. This time, they both came to the door. Deborah Finch looked almost exactly as I remembered her. Perhaps a little more polished, more expensive looking than the junior administrator who had sat in my office 20 years ago with a closed expression and a talent for numbers. She was wearing a pale blue dress and small pearl earrings, and she had the slightly over-composed quality of a person who had rehearsed their entrance. Richard was in his church clothes, though it wasn't Sunday. He was carrying a small gift bag with a bakery name on it, the bakery where we had bought our anniversary cakes for 30 years. I opened the door before they knocked. I wanted them to know I had seen them coming. "Maggie," Richard said, He used the voice I recognized from difficult conversations over the years, calm, measured, the voice he considered his most reasonable register. "We'd like to talk, if you're willing. Please." I looked at Deborah. She looked back with an expression carefully arranged to suggest that she felt no triumph whatsoever. "Come in," I said. I did not offer coffee. I sat them on the living room couch. My couch, the one we'd had reupholstered after the youngest grandchild was born, and I sat in the armchair across from them, and I waited. Richard set the bakery bag on the coffee table. I didn't look at it. "We've been thinking," he said, "about how adversarial this has become. And I want you to know, I don't want this for you, Maggie. I don't want you spending the next year of your life in a courtroom. That's not what either of us wants." Either of us. He was including himself now. He had been prepared for me to notice that. "What I want," I said, "is being handled by my attorney." "Your attorney," Deborah said, and this was the first time she'd spoken, in a voice that was carefully, almost impressively controlled, "is escalating a situation that is going to be painful and expensive for everyone, including you." She paused. "Margaret, I understand that this has been difficult. I can only imagine how you must feel, but I want you to know that I have genuine respect for you. I always did. What happened between Richard and me, that wasn't something either of us planned. These things happen. These things happen. 20 years of planning, an LLC with her address, $147,000 in documented transfers, a threatening phone call, and these things happen." I looked at her and I thought, she is very good at this. She had been good at the performance of sincerity 20 years ago, too. It was partly why the budget falsification had taken 3 years to catch. "Deborah," I said, "the last time we spoke, you told me you had copies of dismissed grievances and that you intended to use them publicly if I didn't cooperate. I reported that conversation to my attorney." A very small tightening around her eyes. "I was upset," she said. "That was not my finest moment. I want to move past it." "I'm sure you do," I said. Richard leaned forward. And here was where the real approach began. Because this was Richard. And Richard had known me for 50 years, and he knew exactly which keys to try. "Maggie," he said quietly, "do you remember the summer of '89? When my mother was sick and we drove down to Galveston every weekend? You didn't have to do that. You did it because that's who you are." He paused. "I know I've hurt you. I know what I did was wrong. But the woman I married, she wasn't someone who destroyed things out of anger." I let the silence sit for a moment. "Richard," I said, "I'm not destroying anything. I'm asking the court to give me what the law says belongs to me. That's not anger. That's accounting." "The LLC," he started. "Your attorneys can address the LLC in discovery," I said. "That's the appropriate venue." Deborah's composure, which had been quite good up to this point, showed its first crack. "Margaret." Her voice was still controlled, but the warmth had thinned. "If this goes to trial, the record of your termination decision, the accusations that were made about your administration at the time, will become part of the public record. Not because we want that, but because the question of character and professional conduct will be relevant to the court's assessment of your claims." There it was, the threat, repackaged as reluctant obligation. "Those grievances were investigated and dismissed as unsubstantiated," I said. "That is also part of the public record, as is the reason for your own departure from BISD. My attorney has that documentation as well." The warmth in the room evaporated entirely. Richard stood up. His face had shifted into something I hadn't seen in 50 years. Not anger, exactly, but the rigid, affronted expression of a man who has realized that the strategy has failed and doesn't yet have a replacement. "This is a mistake," he said. "You're going to regret this approach." "You told me something similar in July," I said. "I'm still here." Deborah stood. She picked up her purse with the precise, controlled movements of a woman suppressing a strong feeling. She looked at me one final time, and in that look, for just a fraction of a second, was the same expression I had seen in my office 20 years ago at the exit interview. Pure, cold fury. "Good morning," I said. They left. The silver Audi pulled away from the curb with more speed than was necessary. I closed the front door and stood in my hallway. My hands were doing the thing they did, the faint tremor I had noticed since July, which my doctor said was stress-related and would pass. I pressed them flat against my thighs and breathed until it stopped. I was afraid. I will say that plainly because I think people who tell stories like this often erase the fear in retrospect, and that is dishonest. I was 63 years old. I'm sorry, 73 years old. And I was fighting people who were motivated, organized, and not above threatening me. And fear was a reasonable response to all of that. But the fear, when I examined it, had a quality I recognized. It was the same fear I had felt every time I walked into a difficult meeting, every time I had to make a decision that would upset someone powerful, every time I had recommended a termination, or denied an appeal, or stood on the unpopular side of an institutional decision because it was the right side. It was the fear that told me I was in the right place. I went to the kitchen. I put the bakery bag, unopened, in the trash. I called Walter Grimes and described the visit in full, including the renewed threat about the grievances. "Good," he said. "That's the second time they've used that as leverage. The pattern is useful." "What does Patricia's new information look like?" I asked. "She'll have the full report by Thursday," he said. "I think you're going to want to read it very carefully." I thanked him and hung up. I watered my tomatoes. I put a load of laundry on. I called Adele and talked to her for an hour about roses and grandchildren and nothing important at all. The fear was still there, but underneath it, steady and quiet, something else. Resolution, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. The trial date was set for a Thursday in March, 8 months after Richard had sat across from me at the oak kitchen table and delivered what he had apparently assumed would be an uncontested departure. He had been wrong about that. Walter had spent 6 weeks preparing. Patricia's final report ran to 41 pages and included a timeline, annotated bank records, and a complete analysis of the LLC, which turned out to have been incorporated 2 years and 3 months before Richard's announcement, funded in part by transfers from our joint account, and used to pay for, among other things, a deposit on an apartment lease and 2 international trips that Richard had attended under the cover of professional conferences. The trips had been taken with Deborah Finch. I had the documentation. Walter had the documentation. The court would have the documentation. The morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully. I wore the gray suit I had worn to administrative reviews and difficult meetings for 30 years, not because it was my nicest outfit, but because it was the one in which I had always known exactly who I was. I drove myself to the Jefferson County Courthouse. Linda was waiting outside with Rosemary and Adele, who had driven from Port Arthur at 5 in the morning to be there. I hugged each of them. I did not cry. "You ready?" Linda asked. "I've been ready for 8 months," I said. The courtroom was smaller than people expect from television. Wooden benches, fluorescent light, the particular smell of institutional air conditioning. Richard and Deborah were already seated at their table when we arrived. Richard did not look at me when I walked in. Deborah did. Her expression was composed, but something behind it was working hard. The judge was a woman named Honorable Claire Boudreau, who was 55 years old, had been on the family law bench for 11 years, and according to Walter, did not tolerate delays or incomplete disclosures. Walter presented our case methodically. He began with the community property timeline. 48 years of assets accumulated jointly, documented by tax returns, bank statements, and property records going back to 1978. Then he introduced Patricia's report. Patricia testified herself calmly and precisely, walking the court through each transfer, each restructuring, each LLC payment, in the even documented language of professional forensic accounting. Richard's attorney, a man named Carver, objected 11 times in the first hour. Judge Boudreau sustained 3 of them and denied the rest. Then Walter introduced the LLC documentation, the incorporation date, the funding source, the payments classified as consulting fees, the lease deposit, the travel expenses, and then, last, placed carefully at the end of the sequence so that its weight would be fully felt, the 2 wire transfers to the out-of-state account and Patricia's finding of where that account led. It led to a personal investment account in Deborah Finch's name, opened 14 months before the divorce filing. Carver requested a recess. Judge Boudreau denied it. In the recess that came at noon, I sat in the hallway with Walter and said very little. Through the glass doors, I could see Richard and Carver in conversation. I could see Deborah standing slightly apart from them, very still, in the way that certain people stand when they are calculating rather than feeling. When court resumed, Carver made a motion to introduce the BISD grievance record into evidence on the grounds of character relevance. Walter had anticipated this. He responded with a prepared brief. The grievances had been investigated and dismissed as unsubstantiated within the normal institutional process. Introducing them was prejudicial, irrelevant to property division, and, pointedly, that the opposing party's own departure from the same institution had involved substantiated findings of document falsification, which Walter was prepared to introduce as counter-evidence of character if the court permitted the comparison. Judge Boudreau looked at Carver over her reading glasses. "Counsel," she said, "I'm going to need you to help me understand what the relevance of administrative grievances from over 2 decades ago has to do with the division of marital property in this case." Carver began an explanation. It was not convincing. "Motion denied," Judge Boudreau said, and that was the moment. That was the moment where I watched Richard Holloway, who had spent 75 years being the most reasonable man in any room, lose the thread entirely. He leaned over to Carver and said something. Carver put a hand on his arm. Richard pulled his arm away. He stood up, actually stood up in the middle of proceedings, and said, loudly enough for the entire courtroom to hear, "This is a manufactured case. Those transfers were legitimate business decisions. I have a right to manage my own finances." Judge Boudreau looked at him with the expression of a woman who had been a family court judge for 11 years. "Sir," she said, "you will be seated." Richard sat. His face was the color of old brick. Deborah did not move. She was perfectly still, and in her stillness, I could see the very specific quality of a person who realizes, in real time, that the situation has escaped control, and who is deciding in that same real time whether to attempt to recover it or to cut their losses. She chose to remain still, which told me her calculation had reached its conclusion. I sat at my table with my hands folded and my face composed, and I thought of nothing in particular. I had said what I had to say. Patricia had said what she had to say. Walter had done his work. The documents were in evidence. There was nothing left to do but let the truth sit in the room and do what truth does when it has been properly arranged and there is nowhere left to move it. Judge Boudreau delivered her ruling 17 days after the hearing in a written decision that Walter read to me over the phone on a Tuesday morning while I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold in my hand. He read for 22 minutes. When he finished, there was a silence. "Maggie," Walter said, "I have practiced family law in this county for 31 years. This is a very good ruling." It was more than good. It was complete. Judge Boudreau found that the preponderance of evidence supported the characterization of Richard's financial actions as deliberate pre-divorce dissipation of community property assets. The $147,000 in documented transfers, including the payments to Deborah's investment account through the LLC, were ordered to be remedied through an offset of Richard's share of the marital estate. The IRA reclassification was rejected. The court found that the underlying funds had been accumulated during the marriage and constituted community property subject to equal division. The house on Clover Street was awarded to me outright, with Richard required to sign over his interest within 60 days. The court found that forcing a sale under partition would cause disproportionate harm to the non-offending spouse. Monthly spousal support was set at a figure 3 times the original offer for a period of 7 years. Additionally, and this was the part that made Walter's voice carry a particular quality, Judge Boudreau's ruling included a specific finding that the LLC had been used as a vehicle for concealing marital assets, and she referred the matter to the appropriate authorities for further review regarding potential fraudulent transfer violations. That referral was not a criminal charge, but it was a formal flag on the judicial record in Richard Holloway's name. In Deborah Finch Holloway's world, that flag would follow them. I sat very still after Walter finished reading. The coffee cup in my hand had been cold for quite a while. "What happens next on their end?" I asked. "Carver has 30 days to file an appeal," Walter said. "I think they'll file one. I also think they'll withdraw it within 60 days when they run the numbers and realize an appeal is unlikely to succeed and will cost more than the settlement they're trying to avoid." "And the referral?" "That's out of our hands," he said. "It'll go where it goes. Could be nothing, could be something. That's not our part of the story." I thanked him. I told him I would come by the office to settle the final billing. We said goodbye. I put the phone down on the kitchen table. The oak table. My table. I looked around the kitchen. At the window over the sink, where I had looked out for 34 years at the same backyard, the same fence line, the same pecan tree that needed trimming every other fall. At the cabinet where I kept my good dishes. At the hook by the back door where I always hung my garden hat. He had thought he could take all of this? He had spent months arranging it. He had brought in Deborah Finch, of all people. Deborah Finch, who had once sat in my office and told me I would regret the day, and who had spent 20 years turning that sentence into a plan. And together, they had done everything they could to erase me from my own life. And they had failed. Not narrowly, completely. I called Linda first. She was quiet for a moment when I finished telling her, and then she said, "Mom," in a voice that held 40 years of everything. And we both sat with that for a moment. I called Rosemary. I called Adele. I called Carol Simmons, who immediately said, "I knew it, Maggie, I told you," with the satisfied emphasis of a woman who had been following the story closely. Then I put on my garden hat and went outside. The pecan tree needed trimming. The tomatoes needed turning. The roses Adele had given me were coming into their second bloom of the year, the deep red ones along the back fence, and they needed deadheading if they were going to keep going. I worked in the garden for 2 hours, alone, in the afternoon light, and I did not think about Richard or Deborah or $147,000 or any of it. I thought about the garden. I thought about what I would plant in the fall. I thought about whether to have Linda and the grandchildren down for Thanksgiving this year, and whether Rosemary could come, and what I would cook. The appeal was filed, as Walter had predicted. It was withdrawn 53 days later. The house on Clover Street remained mine. My life. The one I had built. The one that had been built around me without my knowledge. the one I had refused to let be taken, remained mine. That was enough, more than enough. It was, in fact, everything. The first autumn after the ruling was the most beautiful I can remember in a long time. Perhaps I was simply paying attention in a way I hadn't for years. I had the house repainted, the exterior, which had needed it for 3 summers. I chose the same yellow, but a shade brighter. When I came home and saw it in the afternoon light, I stood in the driveway for a full minute before going inside. Linda came for Thanksgiving with her husband and the grandchildren. Rosemary came, and Adele, and Carol Simmons, and Reverend Gloria Tate, who brought a sweet potato pie that disappeared in 11 minutes. Every seat at my dining room table was full. In January, I enrolled in a watercolor class at the Community Arts Center. I had no talent for it, but it turned out not to matter. Rosemary joined me, and we went every Thursday and once got gently reprimanded for disrupting the class. I was not untouched by what had happened. There were quiet evenings and heavy mornings. But those moments grew smaller and further apart, and eventually became simply part of the texture of a life that had changed. Not evidence of damage, just evidence of having lived a long time. As for Richard and Deborah, the financial remediation required by the court had cost Richard considerably more than the original settlement would have. Between the asset offset, the spousal support, and attorneys on 2 fronts, the resources he had spent 2 years quietly accumulating were substantially depleted. The silver Audi was sold within 6 months. Their relationship, from what reached me through Carol's network, had acquired a quality that could be described as pressurized. The shared project of dismantling my marriage had not translated smoothly into the ordinary business of a life together. I had observed this before. It is not uncommon. I bore them no particular malice. Malice is expensive, and I had better uses for my energy. What I felt was closer to the calm interest one feels watching a situation resolve itself according to its own internal logic. They had made their choices. The choices had made their consequences. And on a Thursday evening in late May, I sat on my back porch with a glass of iced tea and looked at my garden. The raised beds were full. Adele's roses were blooming along the fence. The pecan tree had finally been properly trimmed. It was a very ordinary evening, warm, quiet. I cannot tell you it was perfect. I can tell you it was mine. At 73, I learned that it is never too late to fight for what is yours. Not with anger, with preparation, documentation, and the willingness to stand still when someone wants you to run. What would you have done? If this story meant something to you, share it. Someone out there needs to hear it. Thank you for listening.